Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing a deep dive, neutrally unpacking a really debated historical thesis. We're looking at the work of conservative historian Raymond Ibrahim, and specifically, we're deconstructing his arguments about Islam, the historical Crusades, and how it all ties into modern geopolitics with the West. Now, just to be super clear right up front, our goal here isn't to take sides. We're simply laying out the source material as is so you can really understand the foundation of this controversial worldview. Let's get right into it. Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The core thesis on Jihad, 2. The conquest of Christian lands, 3. Redefining the Crusades, 4. Islamic doctrine versus practice, 5. The Muslim Brotherhood's strategy, and finally, number 6, modern geopolitics in the West.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the core thesis on Jihad, examining the doctrinal claims.
So what's truly striking right off the bat is how strictly Ibrahim defines jihad. In a lot of academic circles today, you'll hear jihad described as this internal, personal, spiritual struggle. But according to Ibrahim's reading of the 4 primary schools of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, the core doctrine of jihad is explicitly defined as offensive expansionary warfare. Its literal mandate, he claims, is to conquer and subjugate non-Muslims. He argues this isn't some modern reaction to Western colonialism, but a foundational law that goes way back. Moving on to Section 2, Conquest of Christian Lands and the Rapid Expansion of the 7th Century.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this historical expansion, the source posits that the pre-Islamic Middle East and North Africa were actually overwhelmingly Christian. Take the word Copt, for example. Today, we mostly think of Copts as a Christian minority living in Egypt, right? But Ibrahim points out that the word is simply a derivative of the Greek word Egyptos, which just refers to the indigenous native people of Egypt. Egypt itself, he argues, was a fully Christian nation before the Arab conquests.
Tracing the historical timeline brilliantly illustrates the sweeping scale of Ibrahim's narrative. He argues that in just one single century, literally from the death of Muhammad in 632 to the Battle of Tours in France in 732, Islamic forces violently conquered a staggering 2/3 of the known Christian world. And that campaign didn't just stop there. He notes it stretched all the way to the Islamic siege of Vienna in 1683. Now, according to the primary sources Ibrahim cites, this wasn't exactly a peaceful assimilation. Conquered Christians and Jews, often referred to as people of the book, were given a very strict 3-step choice under Islamic law. Step 1, convert to Islam. Step 2, keep your religion, but you have to pay a special tribute tax called the jizya, essentially forcing you to live as a heavily restricted, second-class citizen known as a dhimmi. Or Step 3, fight to the death.
Which brings us to Section 3, redefining the Crusades. Was it unprovoked aggression or a belated defense?
All right, this is where things get really fascinating, because we see a massive contrast between 2 totally different views of history. The standard academic narrative, the one you probably learned in a Western university, frames the era before the Crusades as centuries of relatively peaceful coexistence, right? A peace that was abruptly shattered by greedy European papal power plays. Well, Ibrahim flips this entirely on its head. He insists that the Crusades were actually a desperate, retaliatory defense, a defense provoked by 4 continuous centuries of violent Islamic expansion and atrocities against Christians in the East. To anchor this perspective, the source leans on prominent historians like Bernard Lewis. Lewis famously framed the Crusades not as early European colonialism, but literally as a belated response to nonstop aggression. Ibrahim argues that if you look at the Crusades in a vacuum, completely ignoring the context of the preceding Islamic conquests, you're looking at an intentional manipulation of history. And he actually pulls this ideological clash right into early American history, too. He points to Thomas Jefferson's absolute shock when dealing with Barbary pirates from North Africa who were actively enslaving American sailors. When Jefferson asked why they were doing this completely unprovoked, the ambassador allegedly told him that it was their right, commanded by their holy book, the Quran, to make war upon infidels, kill them, and enslave them. Let's transition to Section 4, Islamic doctrine versus practice, and separating the individual from the ideology. So Ibrahim argues that we absolutely must separate the individual, everyday practitioner from the formal, overarching ideology. On one hand, you have the quote-unquote moderate Muslim, peaceful, neighborly, and totally sincere. But Ibrahim claims this moderate individual actually isn't following the core canonical texts of their religion. On the flip side, the radical Muslim, the one who is violent and expansionist, is, according to Ibrahim, the person who is actually strictly following the historical doctrines of jihad and the laws that punish apostates. He supports this dynamic by pointing to a concept called taqiyya, a doctrine he claims comes directly from Quran 328. The source interprets this as giving ideological purists permission to actually feign friendship and loyalty to infidels while they are in a position of weakness. The idea is that once they achieve a critical mass of power, that fake friendship is just abandoned. And for the source, this explains the confusing gap between peaceful neighbors and violent extremism. Next up is Section 5, the Muslim Brotherhood's strategy for sabotaging the West from within. Tracing this ideology forward into the modern era, Ibrahim notes that the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt back in 1928, primarily as a fundamentalist reaction against creeping Western secularization. Fast forward to a really pivotal moment in 2009, when the FBI confiscated a batch of internal Brotherhood documents. That discovery was a huge catalyst for recent moves by several U.S. states to classify them as an official terrorist organization. And those 2009 FBI documents? They are essentially the cornerstone of Ibrahim's modern warning. He claims these papers explicitly outline the Brotherhood's strategy to wage what they call a grand civilizational jihad. The crazy part is, rather than outward military conflict, their strategy is to patiently exploit Western liberties. They use political correctness as a shield to infiltrate institutions like schools and politics, essentially trying to sabotage the West from the inside out. This brings us to our final section, number 6. Modern geopolitics and the West. It's the clash of civilizations today. So what does this all look like in practice today? Well, Ibrahim argues that adversaries are actively, strategically exploiting modern Western societal norms. He claims the West is uniquely vulnerable right now because of its passivity and a deep-seated fear of being labeled intolerant. By weaponizing the modern woke matrix of oppressor versus oppressed, he argues fundamentalists use mass immigration not as a way to assimilate, but as a literal form of non-military colonization. It's colonization by invitation rather than invasion. And to really underscore the modern human cost of what he sees as this ongoing ideological clash, the source drops a staggering number: 388 million. That is the number of Christians currently facing severe persecution globally, according to Ibrahim, who points specifically to horrific massacres happening right now in places like Nigeria. When breaking down exactly where this violence is concentrated, Ibrahim highlights a very stark trend. Out of the 50 absolute worst countries in the world for Christian persecution today, he notes that a vast majority of them, 37 to be exact, are Muslim-majority nations. To sum up his entire worldview, Ibrahim echoes the famous Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington. By citing Huntington's quote, "The borders of Islam are bloody," Ibrahim firmly aligns with this idea that wherever Islamic populations physically abut non-Muslim populations across the globe, ideological conflict and violence are just inevitable. Ultimately, the source gives a really stark warning that the West is living in a dangerous artificial information bubble. Ibrahim claims that Western academics, politicians, and the mainstream media are willfully ignoring primary historical texts and actual religious doctrines. Instead, they choose to favor these comfortable, politically correct narratives that basically project Western values onto the Middle East, ignoring the reality of the texts themselves. As we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with a really provocative thought based on everything we've just unpacked. If Ibrahim's strict reading of these historical texts and doctrines is actually accurate, if expansionism and conquest are truly baked into the ideology itself, can the West ever truly find a compatible, lasting peace with the Middle East? Or are these two civilizations just fundamentally, permanently irreconcilable? It's a massive, heavy question for sure, but it's one that this source material basically demands we ask ourselves. Thanks so much for learning with us today.